I'm going to start this story off by saying that this is absolutely not one of my most shining moral moments and that I'm well aware that I was a straight up asshole for doing what I did. My only real defense is that I was in a super bad place mentally and needed a mountain's worth of therapy. If you're curious about the circumstances around her, check my profile. Bitch was evil in human form. Now, on with the revenge. I was a weird kid growing up, really weird. It was mostly because I was being abused at home and forcibly isolated. My social skills were so underdeveloped that I had difficulty reading human faces aside from my grandmother, grandfather, and father. Being the weird kid meant I was a juicy target for bullies. It never stopped, but there was one bully that I hated more than any of the others. Well, called her Holly. This girl never passed up an opportunity to make my life hell, and since she lived across the street from me there was nowhere I could avoid her. Holly treated me like garbage. Here are a few examples. She put dog crap in our mailbox on a regular basis. She let my dog out of my yard, and I was never able to get her back. She would also sit on her porch with her friends and roast the hell out of me to entertain them if I so much as put a toe outside of my front door. It went on for years. I hated her with the fiery passion of 1,000 suns, but while my grandmother was still alive there was nothing I could do about Holly. If I did anything to her or fought back in any way my grandmother would punish me for it, and I was more afraid of her than I was Holly, for a very good reason. So I made a plan. I suffered through all the abuse and promised myself that when I was older I would make Holly pay for what she did to me. Thinking of what I was going to do to her when the time was right was sometimes the only thing that kept me going. Over time, Holly grew up and eventually she left me alone and stopped being an asshole. Unfortunately for her by then it was too late. I didn't give a shit about her new moral epiphany. I had been nursing my grudge for 2 decades and it was time for a reckoning. I was going to destroy that bitch. When my grandmother finally died, it was go time and it had 20 years to plan. I wasn't idle while I waited. I'd made it my mission in life to learn as much about Holly as possible, and to do it, I became friends with a few people on the periphery of her social circle. Eventually, I knew more about her and her life than her own mother did. The first step I took in my plan was getting her fired from her job. It took longer than I would have liked, but eventually I managed it. Holly worked at a doctor's office, and I knew that the doctor she worked for was super Christian. Very straight edge, upstanding type of guy. He also had a huge influence on the local community. I decided to become a patient at his office, scheduling my visits to be on the days Holly was off work. After a couple of visits I just happened to notice Holly in the staff photo on the waiting room wall. I made a show of looking surprised and then concerned. I got to the exam room, and the doctor came in shortly after. The expression on my face got his attention, and he asked me what was wrong. I told him that, even though I didn't want to, as a Christian I couldn't keep my knowledge a secret and still sleep at night, because I just couldn't let him endanger his soul and reputation by doing nothing. I had his full attention then, and I asked him as one fellow Christian to another not to tell anyone where he got the information I was about to give him. After he promised he would, I told him that I knew that Holly was using illegal drugs. He was absolutely flawed, and at first he didn't believe me. I told him that I understood his skepticism entirely, but it was easy enough to prove or disprove my information with a drug test. If I was wrong, he lost nothing. If I was right, he was saving himself from trouble down the road. He finally agreed to test her, and he tested everyone else too so that it didn't look like Holly was the only target. See, I wasn't actually lying. Holly smoked a shitload of weed, and I knew that because it was my dad she used to get it from. Had been her weed dude since she was like 15. Her test came back positive for marijuana and much to my surprise, Xanax. Oopsie. The doctor fired Holly on the spot when the results of the urinalysis came back, and then he called me to thank me for telling him what was going on, and before he hung up he told me that I truly walked with the Lord. Y'all will never know how hard I had to fight not to laugh at the depths of his wrongness. I thought I was going to pop a blood vessel. Phase 1. Complete. I know what you're thinking. It's just a job and it's not like she can't go get another one, right? Losing a job isn't the end of the world. Yeah, I'd be wrong. Remember how I said that her boss had a very high reputation in our area? That man called every single hospital and doctor's office in the state personally to make sure that none of them would hire Holly and risk liability and loss of community trust for associating with her. Holly's field of study was all pertaining to the medical profession, so her education was rendered worthless because nobody would hire her. I wasn't done yet. Nope, not even close. She lost her job, and because she had no income her car got repossessed. She still had her family though, 2 kids and a fiancé. Who needs families? Am I right? With the help of a good friend of mine, we catfished the fuck out of her fiancé. My friend is hot AF, and she let me use pictures of her to prove that she was really real. She even got on Skype with him once. When he finally made the arrangements for a face-to-face encounter and booked a hotel room, I texted the screenshots of everything to Holly from a burner number. To say the excrement impacted the oscillating unit would be a vast understatement. They broke up. The whole thing was an ordeal and Holly was devastated. She had 2 kids, no job, and now no fiancé who could help her keep the family afloat. A normal person would have stopped them. Unfortunately, I'm not normal, and I was going full scorched earth. I seethed for 20 years. No way in hell was I going easy on her. Phase 3. With her fiancé gone and no job, Holly was struggling badly. She needed money and she needed it quickly before she and the kids got evicted. Meth is a giant problem in my area. It's high risk, but it's also fast money, and so I started subtly mentioning Holly's situation among my more legally questionable family. Eventually one of my family's friends who happened to be a meth cook got in contact with Holly and offered her a shitload of cash to let him cook dope at her house. It was supposed to be a one-time thing, 2 days, and then done forever. Holly was desperate, so she said yes. Everything went smoothly at first, but dead in the middle of the cook someone called in an anonymous tip about an active cook and progressed to the local narcotics unit. They rolled up on Holly's house at about 3 AM and caught everybody inside, including Holly red-handed making meth. Watching her cry when they handcuffed her and put her in that police cruiser was one of the most gloriously satisfying moments of my life. She was in deep legal to-do, and to make a bad situation even worse, most houses where labs are discovered aren't deemed habitable afterwards because the toxic fumes from the chemicals used to make the drug get everywhere, and it's super hard and time consuming to clean. It's up to the property owner to either hire a hazmat team to clean it or condemn it and tear it down. A lab cleanup costs thousands of dollars. It would have cost more money to clean it than the entire property was worth. So it got torn down, with everything Holly owned still inside. See, you can't take things out of a meth lab because they're going to be covered in toxic residue. It can make you very sick, especially young children. Everything in the residence is usually counted as a loss. Now, some people sneak in and grab stuff anyway, but whatever, it's their funeral. But since Holly was still sitting in jail, there was no way for her to get anything, and none of her close family were interested in risking getting caught sneaking into the house and being accused of stealing or tampering with a crime scene. Holly ended up in jail for a while, and while she was gone the court gave their father, ex-fiancé, sole custody of their children, and Holly was only given supervised visitation. 2 hours every Saturday, if I recall correctly. Revenge is a dish best served cold, and mine was freezing. I was behind every single bad thing that happened in Holly's life, in one way or another, for an entire 5-year period. She decided she liked bullying me and making my life hell, and she figures there would never be any consequences. Instead, I took her reputation, her job, her fiancé, got her arrested and convicted of a felony, and her children taken from her. And the best part is that she has no clue I did it to this very day. She'd forgotten about me. What she did to me impacted my life forever, but to her it wasn't even important enough to her to bother remembering. I was nothing to her, so she never connected me to her problems. Last I heard, she was in rehab for alcoholism and had her parental rights terminated permanently. After she lost her kids, she just sort of gave up and crawled into a bottle and never came out again. I was tempted to tell her, but I decided that the helplessness and confusion about why everything suddenly went to hell in a handbasket was the better plan, because that means that every now and again I can contact her and pretend to give a shit about her troubles, to get a fresh revenge boner about her newest tale of woe. She thinks I'm the nicest person she's ever met. Well, let's start a few years in the past. My great-grandparents planted an orchard. It is now at least 120 years old. My grandparents and my parents were really proud of the peach trees growing in it and did their best to keep them in good health and well. We always threw a big party when the peaches were ready to be harvested and invited all of our friends and neighbors to it. I loved those parties. The neighbors on the property to the south of our orchard were particularly fond of our peaches. They were a bunch of fine old people, and me and the old man, Sam, were pretty good friends. He taught me a lot about woodworking with hand tools only, and we had some great evenings in his workshop, and we finished many a good whiskers in there together. In return, he got a lot of fine peaches, marmalade, homemade peach liqueur, etc. Sadly, he died a good 10 years ago. Cancer is a real asshole. His wife followed soon after. Many suspected it was of a broken heart. They had no kids, so all of their property was left to the state, except his tools and whiskey collection, which he had gifted me a few weeks before he died. In comes Karen. The name speaks for itself. Haircut, attitude, bitchiness, the whole deal. She bought the property of my late neighbors. We hadn't had the kind of money to buy it at that time, as we had met some dire straits the years before and all our savings were gone. The first thing she did, before she actually moved in, was to go round and making demands of the neighbors on the surrounding properties. When it was finally our turn to listen to her gibberish, she told us that we needed to remove half of the trees as the leaves were blowing on her property. We told her in a polite way that we won't comply to her demands, as the orchard is a vital part of our family heritage / tradition / life and has been there for at least 120 years. She was pretty pissed, but did nothing for the time being. There are some things you need to know before I continue with the story. The workshop I mentioned before was situated right at the border to our property. It was a small timber frame building, at least 160 to 180 years old. The regulations in my state are pretty strict concerning old structures. Every structure over 100 years is protected, and you need a special permission to tear it down. Failing to get this permission can lead to a hefty fine. To get the permission to build a new building, it has to be up to code, and you have to ask your surrounding neighbors, and if they agree, you're good to go. Except there is one speciality in my county. You have to keep a certain distance to the border of the property to allow emergency services full access to your property. If one of these requirements isn't met, the building is illegal, or at least only partially legal, and can actually be ordered by court to be torn down. That might come in handy later. So, back to my Karen. After our first encounter with her, she did her best to pester the whole neighborhood. She got the neighbor's dog put down because he allegedly attacked her brat. It later turned out she faked the attack. The dog was the sweetest and most innocent dog you could imagine. A Bernese mountain dog, big, but a real teddy bear. Anyways, she later got us to stop doing our annual peach parties, as she called the police every time for various reasons. Noise complaints. We had a band playing there in the afternoon. Arson. We lit a fire in a designated fire pit in the middle of our property. She called the ATF on us, allegedly making moonshine. My dad had a license to distill for our own consumption. In short, she was a real pain in the bum bum, and after 3 years we decided it wasn't worth it to deal with various officers and law enforcement agencies every time we threw the party, and we decided to quit. After she had reached this goal, she resorted to pestering us to remove the orchard. We didn't cave in, and some things started to get really fishy. Somehow the tires of our trucks got slashed, eggs got thrown on our farmhouse, our cat disappeared and surfaced a few days later in pretty rough condition. It looked like somebody had tried to cut his tail off. Don't worry, he healed up completely, but we actually couldn't prove that she did all that. Then came the day she made her biggest mistake. She had a company come in a sort of secret operation and tear down the old woodworking workshop overnight. 2 days later, they started building a big garage / recreational center / house right where the shop was, but she missed one fine detail, which got pretty important later on. She didn't ask for our permission, nor for the neighbors. A short while after, the trees right next to her property started to get sick. The leaves turned brown in the middle of summer, and the branches started to die. We lost 4 trees before we figured out the cause. Somebody had driven long copper nails into them. We had a suspicion, but we couldn't prove it. So we put up some trail cameras. Perfectly legal, as it was on our own property. We caught her red-handed. My dad confronted her, she apologized, and my dad, being the way too nice guy he is, wanted to let her get off the hook. But not me. The nail she drove into our oldest tree was the final nail to her coffin. I started to investigate. I had some friends at the administration of our county and asked them to do some inquiries. Turned out she hasn't applied for permission to tear down the old shop, nor for permission to build a new building. I further did some inquiries on the borderline of our property. Turned out, the old markers vanished over time and her building was about 3 feet on our property. After I had gathered all this information, I presented it to my parents. At first they were reluctant as they didn't want to start a neighborhood clash. But after I recalled all the things she did to us and our neighbors, they were in. So let the games begin. First we called the authorities on her for tearing down a protected building and presented them with all the evidence we gathered. Then we called the building authorities on her for building a building without permission, not up to code, and not only didn't she keep the required distance to the property border, she also built on our property without our permission. Long story short, turned out the workshop hasn't only been protected because of its age, but also because it was a historical landmark, which played a vital role in a conflict back in the 1860s. She got sued for this and had to pay a fine of an equivalent of about $150,000. She further had to demolish her newly built building, costing an additional $50,000. Got fined for this too, about $83,000, and had to rebuild the workshop on her own expense, which was another whopping $154,000. As it had to be period correct up to the smallest detail, means it had to be built with the correct materials, with hand tools, only, and to the correct dimensions. As you can imagine, paying professionals to build quite a large timber framed building only by hand gets pretty expensive pretty fast. So, all in all, it cost her an equivalent of $437,000 plus further expenses as lawyers etc. This caused her to go bankrupt, so she had to sell the property in the end, which my parents bought, by the way. Last I heard of her was that she moved back to the big city. If you enjoyed the stories, slap the like and subscribe button for more of them, and don't forget to support the original writers with an upvote. Links are in the description. Peace out, and catch you tomorrow.